Hello, and welcome to Slay to Z, a tribute to the entire song catalog of one of the greatest bands of all time, Slayer, where every episode we aim to pick, slice, and dissect all things Slayer. It is 7:50 a.m., proving that it is never too early to talk metal. Today, we take a trip back in time to late 1983 for a first taste of Slayer's debut record, Show No Mercy, and listen to The Antichrist. The Antichrist is the second song on the album and probably Slayer's first bona fide classic. The song was co-written by Hanneman and King, with Hanneman providing the lyrics. We'll of course be primarily focusing on the original 1983 studio recording, but there are many great live versions of this song, as it has been a staple in most Slayer shows since the earliest days. I'll try to give a couple of those a brief mention as well. So before we get going here, I just want to take a moment to say, man, it was challenging getting moving on this episode. My head has just probably been floating between like ADHD and depression symptoms. And the approach avoidance that I've been experiencing has been off the charts. I probably wrote and rewrote this one 3-4 times because, well, I mean, what am I going to be able to say about the Antichrist? Well, friends, I found some words to share after all. You know, covering all these Slayer tracks, it's a nice change of pace to actually be able to talk about the bass once in a while. For all of its lower budget and dated sonic hallmarks, one thing Show No Mercy has going for it in the production department is being able to readily hear Tom's bass in the mix. And while he's basically kind of just following the guitars and plucking along on the root notes, it still is good to hear bass in an early 80s metal and thrash record. Yes, the bass tone is very one-dimensional, but it's also positioned very well within the context of the whole band recording. Slayer, Bill Metoyer, and Brian Slagel seemed to grasp early on that having that extra ingredient and sound reinforcement may not do much to change the song per se, but it can have a significant impact on the overall vibe of a record. Props to them, and props to Tom for keeping up with Kerry and Jeff, and for actually still having a better bass sound than what would come later on the next album on Hell Awaits, with its party bass tone, and you know, it kind of sometimes sounds like it's being played through an 8-inch Gorilla practice amp. Wink wink, if you know, you know. And as for Kerry and Jeff, the guitar work is pretty tame by today's standards, but I have to imagine that it came across pretty aggressive at the time that it was released, if not incredibly innovative. And while the thrash, speed metal scene was still in its infancy at the time, Slayer certainly were not the only ones on the block. Obviously, Metallica had abandoned LA and was turning heads north of Slayer up in San Francisco by this point. Dave Mustaine was still reeling from his unceremonious departure from Metallica and trying to get Megadeth off the ground. Anthrax was on the east coast of the US, finally getting a stable lineup together. And there was Canada's Exciter, Overkill from New Jersey, and several others. But arguably, Slayer were carrying the flag most promisingly in terms of bands that were staying quote-unquote true, and also emerging a little ahead of most of the rest of the pack in general. And songs like The Antichrist represented a bit more thematic and stylistic cohesion than many of the early thrash metal peers. The Antichrist, like much of the material on Show No Mercy, wears its influences on its spike sleeve. Kerry King was quoted at least once saying, "No priest, no Slayer." Indeed, especially for the guitars, the shadows of KK and Glenn loom large, as well as Venom and the Di'Anno era Iron Maiden. Take all of those influences and ratchet the speed up a bit, and you have much of the ingredients that made early Slayer. The riffs are solid, if not earth-shatteringly heavy, and I really want to talk about a couple of sneaky tempo changes in the middle of the track, but I'm going to wait until we discuss the drums to really explore a little bit more. But here I will say that the bridge and solo sections are probably most effective parts of the song, in my opinion. While the roots of Hanneman and King's ubiquitous wailing atonal solos are certainly present in the Antichrist, I feel like I hear more earnest attempts at composition and technique along the way. The guys are obviously still finding their individual and collective voice, but again, the potential is there. Kerry starts things off with the shreddier of the two solos, and I feel like it's pretty damn solid and does, in fact, add to the song. It's not just a lead for a lead's sake. But then Jeff's lead coincides with the drastic tempo change of the bridge and comes in with a pretty heavy-duty kind of chorusing effect, which really complements those big slides, the big slide in and everything, and the big bends on the first half of that lead. It's moody and even kind of melodic before it picks up steam as the song returns to the up-tempo verse riff and Hanneman closes his solo out with a few classic kind of Slayer bends and whammy dives and all of that stuff. It really is solid stuff for a couple of kids. So Lombardo's work on the Antichrist is solid. Although it is very early on, we can already get a sense of his developing style, especially when it comes to his drum fills. The pieces are there, they're just not quite fully realized. And about those tempo changes I mentioned before, Dave sticks with the primary tempo of the song, which is around 120 BPM during Kerry's solo. However, the transition for Lombardo from the up-tempo beat during Kerry's lead to halftime feel when establishing the next riff that plays under Jeff's solo is pulled off so sneakily with a mid-tempo fill. It is really, really cleverly done. But the timing shenanigans kind of continue on as Jeff's solo progresses to its second movement and the song effectively jumps back up to its main tempo. Those changes are so damn smooth that they can pass by practically unnoticed, but they're felt nonetheless. Even beyond the arrangement and general songwriting, this demonstrates just how well rehearsed Lombardo and the guys were when they entered the studio. Especially for being a baby band at that point, the playing is really sharp and Dave is carrying a lot of that weight. Okay, so possibly my favorite bit of trivia from the Show No Mercy era is the legend that Dave Lombardo does not play double bass on the entire album. Now, if this is your first time hearing that, I completely understand if you need a minute to work through the 5 stages of grief with that one. We have denial, which is, after hearing these words from me, immediately doubting and pushing back against the idea of a Slayer record without any double bass. Then there's anger, becoming annoyed with a jackass podcaster insisting that this bit of trivia is legitimate and is somehow like a slight on Dave Lombardo. It's kind of, fuck you, nerd kind of energy. Then bargaining, sounding something along the lines of, well, he probably didn't play double kicks on every song, but he had to have played on The Antichrist or Black Magic or Evil Has No Boundaries. Then depression. I can't believe Dave Lombardo didn't burst out of his mother's womb with the Angel of Death solo fully formed. My whole life has been a lie. Finally, acceptance. After verifying for yourself and understanding that I'm not here to tell you lies, and, more importantly, understanding and knowing that Dave has always been a great drummer, even before he really started putting his left leg to work. Okay, so if I'm being completely honest, there are a couple of parts on Show No Mercy where I really question how accurate this whole story even is. Is it possible that Dave was just that fast ripping triplets with one foot? Of course. It's Dave Lombardo. But damn, there are a couple of parts that are extremely impressive if that is the case. We'll revisit this story more once we cover the songs that have those questionable parts. It is fun to listen to the record through the lens of the legend of Lombardo's right foot, though. And There's maybe a little bit of a Mandela effect going on for some of us fans as well, because by the time Live Undead was released the following year, Dave was definitely adding double bass parts to songs like The Antichrist when playing them live. Who knows? Dave Lombardo, if you're out there and listening, please come on the show, write in, whatever, and let's clear the record once and for all. Well, lyrically, The Antichrist stands out in part because it's one of the relatively few explicitly anti-religion, anti-Christianity songs penned by Jeff Hanneman. As we know, Jeff was largely the war and political guy, but in those early days, he was more of the fantasy/horror/fantasy horror guy, while of course Kerry has always been the anti-religion, anti-authority dude. Hanneman's lyrics for The Antichrist are actually pretty solid for an 18 or 19-year-old inexperienced person. Edgy? Sure. Catchy? Absolutely. Vocally, this is Tom in all of his 1983 glory. The dramatic, almost operatic talk singing punctuated with those infamous falsetto screams. Tom is very intelligible and articulate in his delivery, even if the melody and arrangement is mostly simplistic. I should note, though, that once the song gets to the third verse and the final chorus, Tom pitches up his delivery to a bit more of a histrionic range without the riffs actually changing key, which was actually a pretty clever move because it creates a greater sense of tension before the song wraps up, but allows the listener to hang on to the already familiar verse and chorus riffs. In other words, it keeps this pretty simple song from coming across as overly simplistic, like verse, chorus, verse, rinse, repeat type stuff. Now, having said this, I feel like I need to sidetrack for just a moment. The Antichrist is a perfect example of a Slayer song that shines in the live environment exponentially more than on the original recorded version, and less than a year after the original version was recorded and released, no less. As alluded to before, the version present on Live Undead carries an infectious degree of energy and displays, for possibly the first time, Tom's charisma as a frontman in a live setting, as well as Dave Lombardo's rapidly progressing double bass skills. We'll continue to touch on Live Undead like I did in the Aggressive Perfector episode before, precisely because it's such a cool recording and has such a neat vibe to it that was never captured on any other recorded versions of those songs in the set. I also want to mention the version found on 1991's Decade of Aggression. Here, Tom displays his next vocal evolution, having abandoned the falsetto altogether and talk singing, and now fully embracing the raspy singing screaming. For me, this is the definitive version of the Antichrist, warts and all. In fact, it was the first version of the Antichrist I ever actually heard, but the charm and forward thinking of that OG version on Show No Mercy cannot be overstated. Similar to Angel of Death, there have not been many full Slayer live sets played since the early 1980s that did not feature the Antichrist. It is a solidly written song and a true crowd pleaser. For these reasons, I'm looking at ranking it at, let's go with number 3, just behind Altar of Sacrifice and just ahead of 213. That seems about right to me. As always, if you got some thoughts about where the song should be ranked, I'd like to hear what you got. From where I am today, though, it's right about where it belongs in this early stage of the show here. So before we wrap up today, I wanted to touch base with some recent events in the Slayer world. Yay, Slayer news! Specifically, I wanted to briefly talk about how we collectively learned a couple of weeks ago that Kerry King can actually sing, and sing well. For anyone that may have missed it, King recently released an expanded special edition of his 2024 debut solo album. This expanded release includes 5 previously unreleased demos of tracks from the album, but they're featuring Kerry on vocals instead of Mark Oseguera. During the initial press for the album's first release in 2024, we heard multiple times from both Kerry and Mark that King and both staff had tracked highly produced demos of the album's songs with Kerry's vocals as a roadmap of what Kerry was looking for out of Mark's performances. By all accounts, Kerry's vocals were praised as being really good, but I think most of us in the fandom pretty much assumed that we would never get to hear these demos because, to my knowledge, no demos of any of Kerry's Slayer songs featuring his scratch vocals have ever leaked to the public. So kind of business as usual, but a little bit more of a tease because nobody ever talked about the Slayer tracks and Kerry's scratch vocals on those Slayer tracks or the Slayer demos. Cut to 2026, and to give the album like a sales and streaming bump, King commits to releasing a handful of these demos on the expanded edition. It's certainly achieved its goal because there was a lot of talk about the demos and speculation about what to expect from this kind of more hidden side of an artist that we've come to know a lot about over the last 40 plus years. I don't think anyone expected what we actually got. Kerry could have released the album originally with his vocals only. They are that good. But real quick, I just want to make a disclaimer here that just because Kerry can sing, and he can, that does not make him a singer, if that makes sense. Mark Osegueda is a singer. He's been honing his skills with this instrument since the 80s, much the same way King has been doing with the guitar. Just because King sounds surprisingly good on record does not necessarily mean it would translate in any medium or setting outside of that recording studio. Also, it seems like King would be the first to admit that he wasn't going to be pulling off playing guitar and singing in a live setting, which everyone knows is where King will always prefer to be. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Kerry was quoted in the past as saying albums are a means to an end, with the end in question being touring and playing live. Recruiting Mark to be the actual singer for the band and record was absolutely the right move in my opinion, because Mark will always be able to do things with the vocals that Kerry would not necessarily have been able to do. Mark is an incredible thrash vocalist, and I'm glad that Kerry chose the project and the integrity of the project over ego by allowing a singer, an actual singer, to take the mic. One of these days, I think I would like to do an episode on the Kerry King record since it was obviously Slayer adjacent, and because it really is a solid album. Not individual episodes for each song or anything like that, but just one episode kind of covering the whole record. We'll see when and if I can make time for that. Yeah, right. Anyway, thank you for coming to my Kerry King From Hell I Rise TED Talk. Next time on Slay to Z, we're continuing on through our run of Stone Cold Slayer classics with our first peek into 1985's Hell Awaits record, which has become a personal favorite over the years. Come on back and let's take a listen to the horror of At Dawn They Sleep. Hell yeah. Please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're hearing this. If you want to drop a line to the show directly to give me kind of a textual thumbs or horns up, correct me, or tell me why you disagree with the ranking, whatever. I'm always happy to read your messages at slaytozpod@gmail.com, slaytozpod@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and as always, remember...